Hello and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We check out great theories, earth-shattering discoveries, generally of an esoteric or enigmatic nature. We've been digging into Bible decodes over the last 6 months or so, and this is number 194. All of them are so far from the New Testament, but we will be getting into the Old Testament not very soon, but eventually, and that will be very explosive. But hopefully, this is proving to be somewhat explosive as well. Basically, radioactive. Atomic explosivity, and that's because we've been exploring the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. The New Testament, according to the theory, was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, Emperors Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. They were in charge of the Roman Empire, and according to the theory, they wrote the Gospels as a piece of psychological warfare against the Jews in order to try to really mellow out or tame or domesticate or prune or even graft the Jews, graft themselves, graft the Roman emperors onto the culmination of the tradition of the Jews, like the lineage of the Jews. The motive makes sense because the Romans had just gotten done with a war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD called War of the Jews, and Vespasian and Titus were the two military commanders for that war, and they were both wounded in the war. So they had a little bit of an axe to grind. They also knew that the Jews had been a constant thorn in the side of the Romans since the Romans took over in 63 BC, so for over 130 years, and the Romans felt like they were super high maintenance, more high maintenance than any other tribe or nation that they governed in their empire, and that was because of their jealous and zealous monotheistic God who called them the chosen people, creating xenophobia and separatism, and their God with a small g, who had obsessive compulsive disorder. I say he was jealous and zealous, and he had a smoking addiction to animal fat, and he was so weak that he needed to rest every Saturday, and he was obsessive compulsive in that he was obsessed with purity and hygiene and dietary strictures against graven images. So he had all of his people on so many different rituals, and they were willing to die to maintain these rituals, and that led to a lot of high maintenance for the Romans. They had to constantly basically constantly kill the Jews who were, too zealous about keeping up their rituals. And so, according to the theory, the Romans wrote the Gospels, taking advantage of the fact that the Jews, were waiting for a Messiah. But the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was a military commander, one that would lead them to throw off the Roman yoke. But there were a number of self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs that rose up during this uprising in 66 AD, in fact. So instead, the Romans proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the slaveholding Roman centurion had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and requesting his God to forgive the Romans, while at the same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers who were Jews, exchanging dirty graven images, Roman money, for the kosher Jewish money, so that they could be used to buy the sacrifices. That Jesus also excoriated those people who were selling the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals outside the temple for the sacrifice. So Jesus is doing harm to the Jewish rituals, while at the same time being completely deferential toward Rome. And he is that way throughout the Gospels, with no exceptions. And Paul is even worse in his epistles, both the real ones and the whatever they call Deutero-Pauls. The Romans had clear motive. This was right down the middle of the alley of their MO. They created a number of other religions in the first century for psychological warfare purposes. They had certainly the means and the opportunity. In fact, they were the only people who had the means and the opportunity, because they had a monopoly on censorship, a monopoly on publishing, and a monopoly on distribution. But the circumstantial evidence becomes real when we look into the Gospels, along with another work that the Romans put together at that same time, which was a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews, called the Jewish War, or War of the Jews. And they wrote this under the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, or possibly Josephus. And don't really know whether Josephus was a real person or not. I am inclined to think he was not, judging from reading his autobiography and how unbelievable that is. But he was, according to his autobiography, was a Jewish military commander in this war, but he surrendered to Vespasian, and he defected to the Romans, believing that the Romans now had God on their side. And then he predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor, which he did. And so when he did, Vespasian pardoned him, brought him to Rome, at least eventually, and hooked him up with the court historian position and gave him a townhouse at Caesar's palace. And so Josephus is undoubtedly an agent of the Roman royal family, whoever he is. His name is actually Flavius. He adopted him. And if you read War of the Jews by Josephus, kind of at the same time that you read the Gospels, and looking for parallels, you will find legion parallels in the Gospels with War of the Jews. And they take many different patterns and different families. A famous one discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah is that the 3-year ministry of Jesus in Judea is a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus in Judea. In Josephus, every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. They go there in the same order, and at each location they undertake a similar or parallel event or consequence or episode. And the episodes are all 40 years apart. And this is like over 40 consecutive events, all in the same order. Also, many of the prophecies made by Jesus in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, especially the prophecy where Jesus predicts in the fall of Jerusalem, which he blames on the Jews, and he says that the fall of Jerusalem is the ushering in of the second coming of Jesus. So when Titus destroyed the temple or the city of Jerusalem, he became the second coming of Jesus. And that's like what I was saying, how Titus grafted himself on to the lineage of the Jews, all the way from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses and David and Solomon, and the prophets, and all the way down to Jesus, and then to Titus. So this was a mean-spirited psychological operation to pretty much end the tradition of the Jews. And Michael Menescot's, in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, also dug into the book of Luke looking for parallels with War of the Jews, and found over 250 of them. He actually graphed them on a chart using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every place there was a parallel, he plotted a point, and putting all the points together, he had created 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars, APTVS. Incidentally, the New Testament and Josephus are both written in Greek, which was the kind of the universal language of Rome, whereas the Latin was more of the elite Romans. But in Judea, they were speaking and writing in Aramaic, and very rarely in Greek. So anyway, having presented the Roman origins hypothesis, we're trying to apply it. We applied it to the apologetics of Lee Strobel and his book, A Case for Christ, which is really the book that a Christian will give you if he's trying to convert you. And it turns out that Mr. Strobel and his scholars that he interviews were not familiar with the Roman origins hypothesis, and in doing so, they ironically, trying to make the case for Christ, they unwittingly make the case for Caesar, because they use a lot of arguments in absentia, where they say, well, there is no evidence at all, and so, we can resort to a supernatural explanation. But if they knew of the Roman origins hypothesis, they would recognize that there is a logical and simple explanation that explains all of the facts. And so the supernatural explanation is no longer necessary. Now we're looking at a piece of skepticism called Nailed by David Fitzgerald, where he goes over a lot of the Christian mythology, myths that Christians hold, where they think that they kind of have the high ground in terms of the evidence, but he kind of chops it down and shows that their evidence is much, much weaker than they thought it was. And, I would just say that his critique would be much more effective had he known about the Roman origins hypothesis too, because he trips over himself and he nitpicks with stuff that you could just lop it off with the Roman origins. But it's interesting. But again, I must have to say that the atheistic position, which I also call scientism, which you could probably also call communism, is less preferable to me than Christianity. At least Christianity is a limited hangout from the Romans, so they had to put some stuff in there to make it believable, some love thy neighbor kind of stuff. And so the Romans wanted you to be a peaceful, hardworking, honest, solid citizen. And so Christians generally tend to be that, whereas a lot of these communists and scientists get into some serious megalomania. They try to play God themselves. They get into a lot of mad scientists kind of stuff, and they are also rather destructive. Okay, now right here he's talking about Mithraism and astrology. Many decodes of the Bible use a lot of astrology. When they're referring to sheep, they're actually referring to Aries, or when they're referring to goats, they're actually referring to Capricorn, so on and so forth. But he's talking about Mithraism, which was a kind of a contemporary thing going on in just east of the Roman Empire. And Mithraism is an allegorical depiction of astronomical phenomena, namely the precession of the equinoxes, which is the wobble of the Earth, if you believe in the round Earth, or I would say the spheroidal Earth. And it causes the sun to go backwards through the zodiac. And it takes a very, very long time for it to do that, almost 26,000 years. And so if you read Hamlet's Mill, it talks about all these different primitive people having this knowledge of this precession of the equinoxes, and they embed it into their myths. But the part that's interesting to me is just how when you see allusions to astronomical stuff in the Bible, it's immediately rejected as no, that's not what this is. But when they see the same thing in Mithraism, they immediately go to the astronomical, interpretation. And the same thing is true with the Old Testament, where the Old Testament was basically plagiarized from the Sumerian and the family of the Sumerians on down, in Babylonians, and but scholars will look at the Sumerian or Shumerian texts as being myths. But even though the Old Testament is copying the Sumerian, they look at that as historical fact. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, now he's talking about Mosaic depiction of Christ as the sun god. This is the sun god who's going backwards through the zodiac. So he goes through, the Aries, that's where he's the lamb. And then, back into Pisces and the fish. And then back into Aquarius, the water bearer. So, the Mosaic depiction of Christ as sun god, you can see that. I think that's in a lot of Roman iconography, Roman Catholic even iconography. The Christ with the sun rays sticking out of his head. Helios, complete with solar chariot. Sun god associations of Jesus like this suggest influences from the imperial Roman sun god cult that began around the year 200. In 313, Constantine openly conflated Sol Invictus and Christ Jesus. Constantine was never, he was a pagan. He included the Jesus Christ stuff within that, but he was a sun god worshiper. This led to 4th century fusions like Jesus' birthday being celebrated on winter solstice, December 25th. That's when the sun goes down and it's at its lowest point for those 3 days right after winter solstice. And then he rises again. Most mainstream scholars argue that these astrological connotations are a later fusion and accept that in the Gospels, the 12 disciples actually represent the 12 tribes as opposed to the 12 houses of the zodiac. I would go for both. The devastating implications were not lost on Couchot. In The Creation of Christ, he concludes, the God-man does not receive the name of Jesus till after his crucifixion. Mark's entire gospel is a treasure trove of symbolic rather than historical meaning. The original gospel was an allegory constructed from a variety of sources, both Greek and Jewish. Classic Homeric themes, possibly selected sayings from the Gospel of Thomas, snappy one-liners from Cynic and Stoic philosophies, bits of astrology and sacred geometry, Pharisaic parables and proverbs, names from Paul's epistles, and above all, as with Paul's, motifs from the Hebrew Scriptures, Psalms and the Jacob's Well story in Genesis, and passages from Ezekiel and 2nd Chronicles. So that's what I'm saying. It's this Roman origin. This is the limited hangout. They put all this stuff in there to kind of to gain your trust, make you think, yeah, this is good stuff. Oh, I see this stoicism. Oh, yeah. Well, look at all these parables and proverbs. to bait you in, but the whole thing is a fiction. So Mark is, or, you know, it's a fiction, but it could be based on a real story. I'm not denying that. But, and it probably is. It may be based on the story that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or it could be based on a story that is just kind of more close to the, you know, the bloodline story. That maybe Jesus was not a god, but that he was a king. That he was, he had, you know, he was part of a bloodline going down the generations, and that bloodline maybe was related to some one of these Elohims, Yahweh, or another one of these gods with a small g that seem to be all over the place in the Old Testament. Mark is one great parable to conceal the secret, sacred truths of a mystery faith. And now he's talking about Bart Ehrman. The only defense left to them was the devil did it. So they invented the concept of diabolical mimicry, that Satan was able to decipher the Old Testament prophecies, and foreseeing the coming Christianity, used his evil powers to inspire the heathen nations to preemptively copy all the rites and rituals, theological ideas, and religious language of true Christianity, even the details of the life of its Savior centuries before Christianity even began. Yeah, well, so part of the Romans origins hypothesis is that they also created the concept of Satan that is entirely fictional. The concept of Satan doesn't arise in the Old Testament. There are a handful of mentions of Satan in the Old Testament, but each one of them is like an actual human. It's not a supernatural entity like it becomes starting in the New Testament. But I would argue that that is even more pronounced after over 1,000 years later, when you get to Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost and others, but especially in the 20th century with the depictions from Hollywood and cartoons, and you know, in the depictions of Satan metastasize after the New Testament. The mere fact that Jesus is the Son of God is a huge indication that he is a new creation based on the classic pagan model. It's only when other Mediterranean gods like Zeus begin having demigod sons with mortal women that God suddenly announces that he has a demigod son too. The very question of who stole from whom, Christianity or the mystery faith, misses the most essential point. Christianity is a mystery faith. In Acts 1:15, it is claimed by so-called Luke that there were only about 120 believers after the death of Jesus, but asserts that a few miracles later, the population had gone up to 3,000 and finally 5,000 before Stephen is martyred and all the believers scatter, except the apostles, we're told. And that's in Acts 8:1 and Acts 11:19. Christians must have been extremely rare indeed throughout the entire empire, and even at Rome, where Pliny, guess that's Pliny the Elder, had decades of legal experience. For this means he never once saw a trial, or this is Pliny the Younger, where Pliny had decades of legal experience. For this means he never once saw a trial, nor had a Christian brought before him, nor ever heard the issue discussed in the Senate, courts, or porticos, or by any of his peers. Not in Asia until this occasion. And this is a letter that he wrote to Emperor Trajan. So that was probably in the early 2nd century. But none of this is legitimate because they're both Roman emperors, or close, associates of Roman emperors. And so this is all part of the psyop that lasted for a couple of generations. And Pliny the Younger is, I think, the prime candidate to be the author of the Pauline epistles. Christians are scarcely to be found before 250 AD. The two fullest histories written in the early 3rd century make no mention of them whatsoever. And both Hopkins and Fox, don't know who they are supported by the early church father Origen, who admitted in the mid-3rd century that Christians were only a tiny fraction of the population. Now, there's certainly a question of whether Origen was also written by the Romans, even at his late date. Roman Piso and Abelard Reichlen both claim that the Romans wrote the church fathers also to make it look like there was activity going on in the Christian world between the crucifixion and between Constantine, those 3 centuries. They tried to create a buzz, or like at least historicize a buzz among Christians, that there were actual events going on and thoughts being exchanged, and people believing. Its eventual emergence after a slow, painful crawl for 300 long years was thanks to the collapse of Rome. Or maybe it wasn't the collapse of Rome. Maybe Rome collapsed. Maybe Rome grafted itself onto the end of the tradition. And so Rome just kind of dropped the name of the Roman Empire and turned into the Roman Catholic Church. During the centuries that Roman civilization enjoyed prosperity and security, Christianity had little to offer. As long as the Pax Romana held, right. But once that broke down, then people needed something else. So crisis began with the assassination of the young Emperor Severus, which kicked off decades of continuous civil war and short-lived emperors. As each grabbed power, they needed ways to raise cash quickly to pay the enlarged army.